This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, today we got a special guest on the podcast. His name is Tim Mahoney. So he is an investigative filmmaker, and he runs Patterns of Evidence, which makes documentaries about investigating the historicity of the Bible. So these include the Red Sea Miracle, the Exodus, the Moses Controversy, and his latest documentary, which is actually a two-part documentary called Journey to Mount Sinai. And so that's what we're going to spend a lot of time a lot of our time today, rather, talking about that. It's actually a 4-hour-long documentary that he's releasing in two parts. And what that documentary is doing is it is basically challenging the accepted narrative that traditional Mount Sinai is found on this place in the map. And he's actually exploring, I guess you could call it, the top 6 options that are potentially better than the traditional option of where Mount Sinai is. And so we go back to the beginning where we talk about why he wanted to become a documentary filmmaker, how he was able to make that happen. But then I even asked him the question of why should we really care about where Mount Sinai is? Do we need to know exactly where something is? Because again, we don't know exactly where Jesus's crucifixion took place, the exact pinpoint location on the map. We don't know where the wood from the crucifix is, even though I'm sure there's somebody in the Catholic Church that'll sell you a piece of it or something like that. But there's a lot of things out there that we don't know the exact location, and it's fine. It doesn't really affect the foundations of our faith. So I really liked his answer on that. We go into where people think the traditional Mount Sinai is and where we got that idea. Some of the people whose research have kind of helped mold this modern overall sense that there's probably something else here that we haven't taken into account, and where the Bible can help us, the stuff that's outside the Bible or extra biblical things, and what that could potentially look like for this, what comes after this whole research project and everything else like that. So guys, I enjoyed my time with Tim Mahoney. So without further ado, let's get into it. Tim Mahoney, welcome to Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you on here, and just as a soft place to land, I guess, to start out this whole interview here, you're a documentary filmmaker, and then I guess you could throw the word investigative documentary filmmaker into there. I'm assuming you didn't want to do that when you were 6 years old playing in the backyard. So I guess take me through the process. Give us the truncated version of how you became that.
Yeah. When I was 6 years old, I was actually just mainly watching black and white TV back in my day. And we had, one of those, I forgot what they call it, but it's like this little footstool that you used to lean on. I mean, I watched TV on my knees, leaning, watching Roy Rogers and shows like that. And I think there was the only closest thing I got to documentary was Mutual of Omaha had some kind of an outdoor show, with lions and zebras. And so I was never thinking I would be involved with making documentary films. I thought for sure as I got older, I actually became interested in making a film after I saw my first feature film. And believe it or not, I didn't go to a movie theater until I was 18 years old. And somebody say, well, why is that? Well, it's because my family was conservative, and it just seemed like there wasn't any movies my family felt were worthy of watching. But when I became 18, Billy Graham had a movie company called Worldwide Pictures, and they made a film called The Hiding Place, which was the true story of this family in Holland, and they were hiding Jewish people in their home and getting them out of the country during the time when World War II was happening. And so I said, hey, Mom, I really, really want to see this movie. And so I went to it, and the first time I'd ever been in getting that sense of the cinema. And I was able to, I actually went to see the film 3 times in 1 week. It really had a power on me. And I thought I was going to go into be a musician, and so I played an unusual instrument called a pedal steel guitar, which is sort of used in country music.
Yeah.
And I had done, I'd played on a few albums in high school, and I left home twice to play with groups that were older. I got on their bus and left for home, and I thought that was going to be my life until I actually went on road and realized how it's not the greatest life to be, traveling around on the bus. at least for me at that time. And I decided, I think I'm going to look for something else. And I thought radio. Thought, hey, I love radio. So I used to hang out at a radio station as a teenager. And then eventually, when I went to this movie, that became the interest of becoming a filmmaker about a year later.
And so you become interested in becoming a filmmaker, but there are a lot of people that are interested in doing things and then they never do it. It's like there are people that are really interested in the idea of being in shape, but then they don't want to actually like go to the gym or run or do any of those things. And so it's like you have the interest. So how do you like make that a reality? Take me through that.
Yeah, I think part of it too is that I have to feel and touch things. So I ended up once I made a decision uh, to become a filmmaker, it was very awkward because what I did is I finished college. I took a 2-year associate's degree, and then I heard a radio commercial for this film school. And that then said, hey, am I going to do this or am I going to go in the radio? And I met with the people at the radio place, and I thought I'd go into electronics. And the guy who came from the school said, listen, if you want to go into radio, you shouldn't necessarily go into this side of the business. I was more interested in it. It was more like repairing things electronically. And he says, I don't think this is for you. And then I had this other idea of, well, what if I go to film school? And so I went to a 1-year, it was actually a 2-year film school, but I only went for 1 year. And that opened up it took me to the next level where I then had to make, you're supposed to make films. And I bought a camera and I started looking through it and trying to get an idea, how do you look through a camera? How do you see a shot? And in my particular case, I actually prayed and I said, Lord, I want to be a filmmaker, but I don't really even know what I'm doing. I don't really know how to look through this lens and see anything. And it was like a week later, so all of a sudden I could see I could see shots. I could see them in different places. So I think that God answered my prayer. And I think for a lot of us, if we've got something we think we're supposed to do or have a sense of direction, then I think we need to pray and ask, how can I go in that direction? Show me a way. And so I then started being able to see shots, and that led me to having a sense. I would probably say the thing that has helped me throughout my entire career as a filmmaker is having a sense of direction. Whether that direction is, hey, there's a shot here, or there's a story here, or there's something I need to pay attention to. And I think that's a combination of how God's created me, but I think He creates a lot of us with this antenna, and that antenna is listening to that still small voice. And for me, so the very first films that I made were much more documentary style because I was more or less not working with actors. I was working with just going around with a camera trying to figure stuff out. I made some comedic, productions in college, and then I made some, they almost look like avant-garde. I was interested in music, so I took music and I filmed a sink with water dripping and pouring out, and I put a soundtrack to it because you're just experimenting, right? And so that kind of led me into eventually. I met my wife at that same time. In fact, we made a movie just recently called The Journey Home. And The Journey Home is a testimony of my own personal life and in the sense that I had a calling to make films, but I didn't know how to fulfill that calling. And so The Journey Home it starts really with my wife and I, and then I tell my backstory after that of what happened in my own family. And so when I met my wife, I was like, "Hey, I want to be a filmmaker," and she thought, "Well, that's kind of interesting. How are we going to do that? How do you make a living as a filmmaker when you don't know what you're doing?"
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a process to get there. Eventually, my family, my uncle. My backstory for my childhood was that my dad was abused when he was a kid, and then he was his mother had passed away. He was left kind of alone with his brothers to fend for themselves at their grandparents, and some neighbor abused him sexually, and he had a lot of rage, a lot of anger. And then he went off to the Korean War, and he was in a terrible battle. He received a Silver Star and a Purple Heart for being wounded, Silver Star for bravery. And but he had this rage in him. He eventually came and met my mother, who was really sweet, and we always had to deal with my dad's anger. Eventually, we had to escape because he had threatened to kill the family, and we went in hiding for a long time, just for our own safety. So I tell that story in the film, The Journey Home, and I think it shaped my life because my mother was such a person of faith that she would pray, and we would get down on our knees and call out to God for protection, for provision. I grew up on welfare, so because my dad decided to leave the state to avoid any kind of responsibility to the family, and so we didn't have any income. My mom had 4 kids. I was the oldest, and that began sort of our journey of faith. And I look back on it, and I don't think it was. I mean, somehow God miraculously provided. Some relatives helped us get this little house, and my mom was a real do-it-yourselfer, and she got it all fixed up. And just a little bit at a time. So part of my MO is you find something that people don't have any value in and fix it up, and that's because sometimes there are things that have a lot of value, but not in everyone's eyes. It's like junk to them. But my mother was one of those who could see it. She'd go, "Hey, I think we can fix this up," and we did, and it just taught you how to see the value in things that maybe others don't.
Well, I appreciate you going into all that detail because obviously those were very formative experiences for you as you go into your career and as you start getting into the things that you're interested in. And so for you, it's obviously clear. Again, guys, the website is patternsofevidence.com. You can check out most of the films. Today, we're going to be spending most of our time talking about your newest film, Journey to Mount Sinai, at least the first part of Journey to Mount Sinai, and then we'll get into part 2 whenever that comes out in the future as well. But you have a tremendous amount of interest in not only the Bible itself and God's plan for this earth, but specifically things in the Old Testament, and even more specifically, the things of Moses and the things kind of surrounding the Exodus and a lot of things that are kind of in that vein. And so Journey to Mount Sinai, excuse me, you're trying to find the real location of Mount Sinai and not just going with what we have believed for hundreds and hundreds of years, or maybe even thousands of years at this point, about Mount Sinai being at this particular location. And that's what the documentary is about, at least the way that I would summarize it. So for you and for our audience, how about you give us an idea about what the Journey to Mount Sinai, what is the documentary about? And then I guess specifically, why was that such an area of interest for you that you decided to make a documentary about it?
Those are excellent questions, and the journey to Mount Sinai came about 20 plus years ago. I heard that people were looking for the Exodus route, and they were looking also for chariots and chariot wheels on the bottom of the Red Sea. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but
Sure.
people have heard about that. Well, once I learned about that, and I was involved and brought to shown a film where people were investigating it, I thought, this is fascinating. Could I get involved with this? Because I was looking for a particular, I was looking for something, and I had a sense, and I don't know if anybody in their life has a sense like there's a draw to something. And like I hadn't made any big films at the time. I had made some TV specials on the Bible, and I made one called The Bible Code, which looked for skip sequences, if you believe it, where you would look for equidistant skip sequences in the Torah, and they would look for words or phrases. And that was a book that came out, 25 years ago called The Bible Code, and we made a documentary on that. So I was interested. That began my interest in, nonfiction, more. I think documentary. I think I have found that I've been drawn to it because I know that for the most part, I like it because it's real world, real life. It seems to sometimes be very profound when you look at documentaries. The one challenge with documentaries today is that a lot of them aren't really documentary; they're propaganda.
Sure. Right.
They're propaganda films that have been painted over to say it's a documentary. But a true documentary is looking at multiple viewpoints and trying to get a clarity on, well, what is the truth here? Whereas some films are not, and I think that's the sadness that's happened in this genre. But so in this particular case, I'd heard about the fact that people were searching for these chariot wheels, and not only that, but there was photography coming out of Saudi Arabia that the real Mount Sinai might be in Saudi Arabia, and that was in like 2000, 2001. I started to really seriously plan on going to make a film about it. And then 9/11 happened, and the Middle East got more scary for a lot of people. But I still had this passion to search. And I met a Swedish scientist by the name of Dr. Leonard Moller, who has since passed away. But he had written a book called The Exodus Case. And so I ended up talking with him, and we were able to raise money. And in the spring, in April of 2002, I went into Egypt, and I went to the locations where the Israelites were said to have lived. I went on the routes. I went to different crossing spots along the border of Egypt, and then I went to the Gulf of Suez, and then I went to the Red Sea area where other people believe the sea was parted at the place called Nuweiba Beach. So I went to all these different locations, filming everything. And that began, for me, the first part of the investigation. And I had also then knew that there was more across the Red Sea there in Saudi Arabia that I was fascinated by. And I got a call from a person who said, hey, there's this couple who you might want to talk with. And it was Jim and Penny Caldwell. They had lived in Saudi Arabia. They'd come out. They were the ones who were taking quite a bit of photography. And we talked with them. A very interesting side note to this is that when I heard about who they were was at the same time that Dr. Moller was staying with me from Sweden. We talked to this couple, and they Jim said that he had summited the peak on this particular date. It's in September, and he said it was on my birthday. And Leonard Moller said, "What year were you born?" And he said what the year was. And as it turned out, both Dr. Moller, Leonard Moller, and Jim Caldwell were actually born on the same day in the same year, which some of you say, well, that's just a coincidence. Yeah, it is. It's kind of interesting that two guys who were born on the same day of the same year were searching for this mountain. And it was just kind of fun because we always knew every year when they had a birthday that here these two guys had this unique passion, as it were. And that's how I would explain it, would be that it was an amazing passion that people had. They could not explain. I don't know if you've seen the movie. It's an older film called Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
I've heard of it, like, culturally, but I've not watched it myself.
Yeah, well, Richard Dreyfuss is a character that basically he has this experience where he's like can't get out. He's like possessed with this idea of this mountain, and he takes potatoes and builds this mountain on his dining room table to get to this mountain. And I just joke about it because I think about the fact that these people that I would meet were so moved and spent every resource that they could have and tried to get to this mountain to find out where did God come down from, to Mount Sinai and meet with the Israelites. Was this the location? And so there's this great fascination. And I was caught with the same kind of passion. It's hard to explain for this many years. Here we are. It's been 22 years and counting that I've been working on. And we've produced now 5 feature films on the Exodus, starting with Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus. Then we did the Moses Controversy, which was about the writing of the first books of the Bible and and discovering this language called the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions that is really the basis of the first alphabet. Then we did Red Sea Miracle 1 and 2, and now we're at Journey to Mount Sinai 1, and we're just working on Journey to Mount Sinai 2 as well. So my whole life has been, in the last third of my life here, has been consumed by this interest and passion to investigate the historical credibility of these events.
Well, let's talk a little bit just to even kind of set the stage, because guys, you will be able to access the documentary in the show notes, so you can check it out for yourself. But I guess, where do we get the idea in modernity that Mount Sinai is where most people? Well, I guess let me back up. Where do most people think the traditional Mount Sinai is today? And how did we get to that point of view in modernity where we feel like that's really it? You know, it matches exactly like the maps that are in the back of most of our Bibles. And just to make it even more complicated, a question. I guess one thing that I was struck by as I was watching the film and hearing all these different experts and hearing you kind of take us through everything is, why should we care about the actual location of Mount Sinai? I'm sure you've gotten that question before, but to some people, it's like, okay, we think it's that peak, but it might be that one. And part of it's like, can we just go ahead with the fact that this probably happened and like, let's just move forward. Like, let's trust the Bible and let's just kind of move on with our life. So a lot of questions in there. If you forget one of them, I'll try to remember myself, but go ahead.
Okay, well, first one is, why should we care? One of the reasons why I think that I am involved with this is because a lot of people today that are in mainstream, let's say, scholarship, are saying that there's no evidence for this, so the Bible's not true. So what they're basically doing is, the Bible is being attacked because in the Sinai Peninsula, and you ask, well, where was that? When was this idea kind of put forth? And it was during the time of Queen Helena. I think it's around, I want to say it's around 350 BC, sometime in that time. I might have this wrong, but it was when she was Constantine's mother, and she went searching for, during the Byzantine period, she went searching for biblical sites and, declaring them. And she was told that Sinai was down in this particular area. I mean, the Sinai Peninsula was named Sinai Peninsula because Queen Helena basically declared this is where Mount Sinai is. And so what happens is that these places receive their names because of the way people think. And then other names start to come around those names. So the question of, when you're investigating something, does the place name, did it get its name because people thought it was where it was, or was that the name prior to it? And that was, that's the challenge of using topographical names to sort of find things, because then you're saying, well, these names fit the route of the Exodus. But once again, were those names given to those places so that it would fit the idea of Mount Sinai being in the Sinai Peninsula? And so, but there are other clues in this investigation. It's a 2-film, 4-hour investigation. But the basic question to answer is, why does it matter? It's because the Bible is telling us that God acts in time and space, and that this event really happened. And when so many people were saying the Bible isn't true, you can just ignore it. And the events of the Bible aren't necessarily historical either. If the events of the Exodus then are being, if we're being told by scholars that it didn't happen, then what happens to the words of Jesus? Because Jesus talks about Moses. He talks about events in the Old Testament. And then I actually have had scholars look at me and I say, yeah, but if this didn't happen, then what about Jesus? And they just get this kind of smirk on their face and they go, yeah, that's the reason why I don't believe in Jesus either. So,
well, if I could jump in, Tim, right into that point. Part of the problem that people who are not Christians, or Christians that don't read their Bible, where they get kind of mixed up and I guess flummoxed, is you can't read the Bible as if it's all one type of writing. I mean, there's historical writing, there's, poetry, there's lament, there's, revelation and all the things. There's, I'm kind of getting a little bit tongue tied, but, the prophets, there's prophecy, there's all these different types of writings. And so I don't want to move into the world of blasphemy here. I'm just trying to give the devil his due, and I don't mean any pun with that. But is it possible that the Exodus accounts are not meant to be read historically, but are meant to be read allegorically or something to that point? I'm trying to think, because I know what my opinion is, but I'm trying to think, like, what would a non-Christian or what would a skeptic say in the same vein that we were talking about? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. And I think that there are, even in the description of the events, for example, that the water was parted and there were walls of water on the left and the right. So when we see, let's say, Cecil B. DeMille's recreation of that in the Ten Commandments, what you see is that he shows walls of water standing on end with the Israelites walking through it. But that's what we're told. And then other people would say, well, there was an east wind that blew all night. And so the wind was blowing, and it was a naturalistic reason for it. So some people would say that God works in nature and that miracles are natural. The miracle is in the timing of it, the location, and that it came at the right time. And others would say, no, the wind was not completely physical, it was symbolic as well, and that the events actually happen. But the question of, did the Exodus happen and was there an Exodus? What we found in the first film was that we can see that there's actually evidence for Joseph and his family coming into Egypt at the location where the Bible places them. There's evidence for Joseph's tomb. There's evidence for the plagues of Egypt in corresponding Egyptian documents that people have ignored because they're earlier in time. So what we're seeing is that there's an amazing pattern of evidence. And the whole idea of a more of a scientific approach, which is the pattern approach, science looks for patterns, and they want to see, this is the hypothesis. Can we find a pattern there? So all I've done as a filmmaker is I've just said, well, what does the Bible say, and can we find a pattern? And then how do you explain that pattern? And I listened to different points of view. And that's the way we structured the films in the investigation. But what we're seeing is this amazing pattern that is matching the biblical event. We're just following that through the historical chronology of the Bible.
So one thing that you also describe in the documentary, and again, there's so much content in there, we're not even going to be able to talk about a third of it in our time today. But you do discuss the difference between the Egyptian and the Hebrew approaches to understanding the Exodus events. And I've heard a lot about Exodus and about, hey, why can't we find any of the chariot wheels, like in the sand there, and all these different things. And I can't really get too much into that because, gosh, I don't know, like how much stuff is below the sands in the Sahara Desert or anywhere else in the world where topography has changed or something like that. But I guess just give us an overview as to the differences between approaching the Exodus events in the Egyptian way versus the Hebrew way.
Yeah, I had to actually come up with a way to communicate these viewpoints, and I chose the Hebrew and the Egyptian approach. An Egyptian approach, basically, what I could see was that many people who were using toponyms, toponyms are place names, they were looking at words in the Hebrew, and they're trying to connect them to words in Egypt. And they felt that even the place where the sea was crossed, it was called Yam Suf. And Yam means sea, and Suf has a different meaning. Suf, they were wondering if it was connected to the Egyptian word tuf, which means weedy or reeds or something like that. And so they were trying to basically say, well, maybe this place that was crossed was connected to Egypt, and it was the reedy lakes along Egypt. And so they started to move the Exodus because of the idea of miracles. You started to see more naturalistic explanations. And in the film, The Red Sea Miracle 1, I basically talk about the same time that Charles Darwin was putting forth his ideas, naturalistic ideas for creation and naturalistic ideas for the Bible. People started to diminish the miraculous. It was possibly even offensive to them, and they started looking for naturalistic explanations. And that drew the Egyptian approach, and Egyptologists drew the Exodus story close to Egypt so that all the events happened close to Egypt, The parting happened close. The names were connected, and they followed all that close to Egypt. Now, the Hebrew approach would tell you this. The Bible never uses the word Yam Suf to identify any other location than the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the right arm of the Red Sea. And in all the whenever it's given as a geographical term, even when Moses writes about it, he basically creates the boundary of Israel using the term Yam Suf. So that means that the sea that was crossed had to be on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula, and that the land that they went into had to be in Arabia, what's known today as Saudi Arabia. And that idea is what these films are unfolding, how we got to that place. But I can tell you that the logic is there in a very strong way. And so the Hebrew approach uses the Hebrew understandings of things, and the Egyptian approach uses the Egyptian interpretations. But since the Bible is a Hebrew document, I lean towards what is the Hebrew understanding of it, as opposed to what is an Egyptian understanding of it. So that's how, have you ever seen in the Bible, it says the sea of weeds or sea of reeds?
Mm.
You know, but what does Suf mean? Because there's another definition to it. I think the word Suf means the boundary or border or end of. And it was given as a boundary, the southern tip of Israel. When Moses basically tells what the boundary markers are, he says from Yam Suf up to the Sea of the Philistines, which is the Mediterranean. And that's what they have been historically, and that's what they are today. So what you're seeing, that's why I wanted to basically, and I'm a student. I'm just trying to figure out what I'm learning as I go along here. And I just say, okay, for me to understand this, I need to say it this way. So often when I was filming people, I had to take whatever complexity that they were putting on what they were saying and simplify it so that I could understand it. And then I simplified it so that people could understand it.
So there were a couple of people that were very prominent to this documentary in terms of, everyone talks about we're all just standing on the shoulders of giants or those that came before us. And so if you think about it, someone may spend 50 years of their life trying to figure out this one part that gives us this little grain of theology that we could read in an afternoon, and then we can build off the top of that. So seemingly a lot of people that are interested in this, you included, are really standing on the shoulders of people named Robinson and Smith. And so why were these two people so important for the research that you're doing and really this whole quest to find the true Mount Sinai?
Robinson and Smith were like they were two explorers that were versed in the Bible, and they went out and went on a trail, and they believed, I think, that they were identifying the journey to Mount Sinai. So they favored the Sinai Peninsula location, and but what we'd had to do is look at and go back possibly even further to. There at the same time, there are others like Charles Beek, and I'm trying to think of his name. There are others that were seeing that the evidence. I'm see if I got the book in front of me here. That Midian, where Moses fled to, was in Saudi Arabia, but that was a really hard thing for some people to accept, because let's say several, almost 2,000 years of tradition had placed Mount Sinai in Sinai Peninsula. So you have Robinson and Smith that are basically following and confirming the journey and the route and the distances to the traditional location. And then you have this other scholar who actually, Charles Beek, was a celebrated and decorated medal winner for National Geographic, and he had actually found the source of the Nile. But when he basically came out and said that he thought that Saudi Arabia was Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabia, in that area, it's probably Saudi, in Arabia on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba, he was stripped of his medal. It was that big of a conflict for people to get their head around. And but what I've done as a filmmaker and as a storyteller is that all these characters are part of of this story. They're part of the investigation. And so there are a lot of good things that they have done, but sometimes they were standing on somebody else's shoulders, right? So
Yeah.
so then you have to basically say, well, what's the basis for what they believed? Where did that come from? And then you have to go back to that. Well, if it came from, let's say, tradition of Queen Helena from 1,500 years earlier, then you have to basically go, but is that correct?
So that's obviously very, very helpful research. And even in the documentary, you bring in a ton of different people that have a lot of different expertise. They don't just all come from an evangelical, conservative Christian point of view, certainly not. But they all have a lot of information that they can give to this overall search. So I'm curious what you think are some of the most significant materials that come outside the Bible or outside of typical Protestantism that are able to aid you in this journey to find the true location.
That's a great question, and I'm trying to think through right now. I think that if they're extra biblical sources, one of the things that I'm working on right now is called the Wilderness of Shur, and Shur, Shur. So when the Israelites came out of the sea, they were in the Wilderness of Shur, and that's my understanding. And the question is, where is this wilderness? And many people think the wilderness is close to Egypt, and that Shur means wall. And some people think that the wilderness is connected to this wall along the where the Pharaoh had forts. There was like a protection, a security, of these forts to keep the invaders from coming into Egypt. But there's another way to look at that, in that, and I don't know if there's any other biblical sources other than outside of the biblical sources, the understanding of where Ishmael and his family were sent to, and they were sent east of the promised land. And if I had a map, a satellite map will show you, or a map will show you that there's this mountain ridge that goes from the Gulf of Aqaba all the way up through the Araba Valley, up into the Jordan Valley, in this area where there's this wall. And I believe that is where Shur is. And so there's a lot of tradition, a lot of understanding that's possibly both Islamic as well as Christian, that this is where Ishmaelites lived. This is where, historically speaking, these other tribes were. They were all descendants of Esau, like the Moabites, I believe, are. I'm trying to think of the different other groups that were there in the Bible. We know from other archaeologists that these people lived. And so I think that there are outside sources there. But, when I do an investigation, I don't track down everything because it's just so enormous where we're at. But as far as extra biblical ideas, I think that it's pretty well to know where the Ishmaelites are. And they ended up heading towards the east out from Israel. And even like Midian, the Bible talks about Midianites coming from the east in camels in the story of Gideon. And they had lots of camels and they raided. Well, what we do know is that archaeologists know that the Midianite people lived in that area. And Midian was a brother to Ishmael. He was a half brother. And so these tribes sort of intermingled, and they're all on that eastern side, and they're all also connected to this area of Shur, this wall, and this wall potentially could be the wall of mountains that was a boundary between Jordan and Israel. So that's kind of a complicated answer, but what I'm saying to you is that the archaeology of the Bible and the people groups that the Bible says are in the areas where we know that those are the areas. And when you start to separate that out, you start to realize that means that Mount Sinai has to be in that area, not closer to Egypt.
Okay, I appreciate you breaking down that detail. So, as you mentioned earlier, this is part one that's out right now, but it's technically a 4 hour long documentary that is being released in two different parts. My understanding is you're going to look at the first three potential locations in the first documentary, and then you've got three more in the second documentary, and then I believe at the end of the second documentary, you'll give us your best guess, or where you've come to with all the evidence and all that, to where you think it is. So, tell us a little bit about that process. Is there a potential that there will be a part three? Is there more stuff that you're going to leave teased out there for us? Just take that wherever you want to go.
Okay. Well, I am working my way through the Bible. So if you were to say part three, once we get to the mountain, we're going to basically look at the part three, or the next one will be patterns of evidence. Each time I've used patterns of evidence to give the idea of what the film is about, with a colon, which would basically then tell us that what the subject matter will be. We're going to look at what happened at the mountain, because it says that God made a covenant with the Israelites. Then they build a tabernacle, and they built the Ark of Covenant, and he comes down and in their midst, and the Israelites make a covenant with God. And this is a very significant and important covenant. Originally, Abraham made a covenant with God. Now, Moses brings these Israelites, who've now become a nation of 12 tribes, and they make a covenant to him. And after about a year, I think, at the mountain, they're going to go to the promised land to take it. It was given to them. It was promised to them. This is what this promise was to Abraham 400 years earlier, that your descendants will grow into a mighty nation and they'll be enslaved, but in the future they'll return to this land. But they didn't have the faith. The people, they sent out 12 spies, the Bible tells us, and 10 of them just said, hey, we can't go there. This is too difficult. There's giants in the land. And they anger God to the point where he says, that's it. I'm done with these people. I've lost my patience for the last time with them, and they're all going to have to wander in the wilderness and die. And so the next film will actually look at this covenant, what happened there when they decided not to go in the promised land, and where did they wander. And then after that, we're going to work our way into the death of Moses and Aaron and into the promised land, because we've got tremendous new evidence showing inscriptions at the locations where they came in. And the Israelites, again, a second time, make a covenant with God. The next generation makes a covenant, and there's evidence of the location. There's evidence of a lot of this that we've already filmed in this area of them making a covenant. And then they work their way into the promised land, and there's tremendous evidence that's very unique about with giant footprints coming up from the Jordan Valley, archaeological remains. What do these footprints mean? And remember, I told you about the tabernacle that was built? Well, they were bringing that tabernacle wherever they went. And we're going to go to the location of Shiloh and look for evidence there of what they found at the location where the tabernacle was eventually brought into Israel and stayed for a number of years. So that's sort of the direction, patterns of evidence. The hope and prayer is to work our way through the Bible.
Okay, so we'll make this the last question of the day. I'm curious, in the future, is there something, because always, if you're going to hang with us you're this far and do an interview, I want to give some red meat to my audience. I want to know something that's going to make you uncomfortable to say it. Is there something in the future, like something that's been kicking around in your head? Is there an area that you'd like to really dig into and investigate to kind of figure out that maybe you haven't told a whole lot of people about, that you'd be comfortable letting us know, something cool for the future?
There are multiple things, and that's a great question. But I will say this: I think that we are living in mythologies right now. We think about the Greeks; they had their Greek gods, and the Romans had their gods. Each culture, I think, and each time period has their own mythologies, and we're living in a mythology right now that the future will continue to become more advanced. They're looking at transhumanism for people. They're trying to find ways to basically say you can be whatever you want to be. And the Bible says that it's appointed unto man once to die. But I've been shocked by people looking at finding a way to basically move consciousness from themselves into some kind of machine that they would create or whatever. And so as I'm looking into the future, I'm realizing that there are laws of the universe. And these laws are physical laws, but they're also spiritual laws. And the Bible tells us that in the future, we're going to stand before God, and whether our name is in the Lamb's Book of Life or not is a really serious situation. And I think that people don't realize that how brief their existence is. The creator of the universe has given us this little window of time to recognize who he is. And the heavens declare the glory of God. And what's happening is that many people can be deceived as to why they're here and what their origin is. And I think if I'm as I'm working on more films, it'll be about origin and future. It'll be about these films are films of remembrance and forewarning. And I think that they'll become more dangerous in what they do.
Well, that'll be something interesting to keep tabs on. But Tim, I appreciate you going into all the detail that you have today, but that's all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
And I'll just say that when I say dangerous, I mean spiritually. When you think about what's going to happen in the future, you need to pay attention because we only get one chance at this. So that's what I feel. I think it's time for people to wake up, and whether they're a believer or not, it's time for them to pay attention. So thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to leave it. Tim Mahoney, thank you for coming on Undaunted.Life, a Man's podcast.
Thanks for having me.
There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed my time with Tim Mahoney. But before I let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So the link I've got for you today is a link to the Patterns of Evidence website, so you can check out all the documentaries for yourself. Thank you guys for listening to this episode. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band August Burns Red for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is our song Cutting the Tides, which is off their 10th anniversary re-recording of their album Leveler. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.